Hey guys, welcome back to Cryo Baylogs. If you're new here, we explore the deep lore of science fiction universes in a relaxed, detailed style perfect for falling asleep or just getting lost in another world. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more deep dives like this one. Tonight, we're journeying far back into Star Wars history to explore one of the galaxy's most ancient and powerful civilizations, the Rakata and their infinite empire. The Rakata and the Infinite Empire, masters of the ancient galaxy. In the depths of galactic history, long before the Republic's founding, before the Jedi Order walked the stars, before the first lightsaber ignited its blade, there existed an empire so vast and terrible that its very memory was deliberately erased from the annals of time. This was the Infinite Empire of the Rakata, a civilization that rose to unimaginable heights of power and fell into an abyss of its own making. Their story is one of technological wonder married to the dark side of the Force, of conquest spanning 500 worlds, and of a catastrophic collapse that would reshape the galaxy forever. The Rakata were not merely another spacefaring species among many. They were the builders, the architects of an age when the Force and technology were not separate concepts, but intertwined threads in a single, dark design. Their legacy, though buried beneath millennia of silence, would echo through the ages, influencing events and civilizations that would never know their name. To understand the Rakata is to peer into the galaxy's forgotten dawn, to witness the birth of technologies that would define interstellar civilization, and to comprehend how absolute power, when wedded to the corrupting influence of the dark side, inevitably devours itself. Origins on Lehon, the dawn of the builders. The story of the Rakata begins on a world hidden in the unknown regions, a planet called Lehon. This temperate terrestrial world, orbiting a star named Abo, would become both the cradle and the grave of one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. Lehon was a world of pristine beauty, its surface dominated by vast oceans dotted with archipelagos of verdant islands. Towering trees reached toward azure skies, their canopies alive with the calls of exotic creatures. The beaches gleamed with sand that seemed to capture and hold the light of the system's star, and beneath the waves, coral formations of breathtaking complexity housed ecosystems of staggering diversity. It was here that the Rakata evolved, a species uniquely adapted to both land and water. In appearance, they were striking and unmistakable. Standing roughly humanoid in form, the Rakata possessed smooth, amphibian-like skin that ranged in color from gray and gray-brown to more exotic hues among rarer lineages. The blue-skinned Drute, the red-striped Dicalic, and the black Buxek represented genetic variations that would become increasingly rare as their civilization progressed. Their most distinctive feature was their cranial structure. Tall, elongated skulls housed sophisticated brains, while their eyes protruded from each side of their heads on short stalks. giving them an almost alien appearance that would strike fear into countless species across the galaxy. Their hands were three-digited, tipped with claws evolved for digging through packed earth and sand. These same claws would later be turned to more sinister purposes. Their mouths, when opened, revealed rows of sharp teeth, a testament to their carnivorous nature. This dietary preference would manifest in ways that horrified other species. The Rakata were not merely carnivores, but cannibals, willing to consume not only other sentient beings, but members of their own species. This practice was not born of necessity, but of a fundamental aspect of their nature, a darkness that ran through their very being. But what truly set the Rakata apart from other primitive species was their connection to the Force. From their earliest days, the Rakata were Force-sensitive, their entire species attuned to the cosmic energy that flowed through all living things. However, their relationship with the Force was fundamentally different from that of species who would later form the Jedi Order. The Rakata did not seek balance or harmony with the Force. Instead, they drew exclusively from its dark side, channeling anger, hatred, fear, and aggression. This was not a choice made by individuals, but a species-wide inclination, as natural to them as breathing. For countless generations, the Rakata lived in relative isolation on Lehon, developing their own culture and society. They were by nature conquerors and warriors, their tribes constantly vying for dominance over the limited territories of their island world. Violence was not an aberration in Rakatan society, but its foundation. The strong dominated the weak, and those who fell in battle were often consumed by the victors, their bodies defiled in rituals that celebrated conquest and power. This cycle of violence and domination would have continued indefinitely, confined to a single world, had it not been for an encounter that would change the course of galactic history. Many years before, 36,453 BBY, the isolation of the Rakata came to an abrupt end. Visitors arrived on Lehon, beings unlike any the Rakata had encountered. These were the Qua, a Force-sensitive reptilian species from the distant world of Dathomir. The Qua were an ancient and benevolent civilization, possessing technology that seemed like magic to the primitive Rakata. Most impressive among their achievements was the Infinity Gate, a network of portals that allowed instantaneous travel across vast distances, connecting worlds separated by thousands of light years as easily as stepping through a doorway. The Qua came to Lehon, not as conquerors, but as benefactors, part of a broader mission to uplift promising species throughout the galaxy. They had done this on many worlds before, sharing knowledge and technology with species they deemed worthy of joining the galactic community. The Qua taught the Rakata about the Force, explaining its nature and the importance of balance between its light and dark aspects. They shared technological secrets, showing the Rakata how to harness energy in ways they had never imagined. They spoke of the Celestials, the mysterious beings who had shaped the galaxy itself, creating wonders like the Maw and Centerpoint Station, and who served as the Qua's own benefactors. For a time, it seemed that the Qua's mission would succeed. The Rakata absorbed knowledge with remarkable speed, their intelligence allowing them to grasp concepts that had taken other species generations to understand. They learned to work metal and crystal, to harness energy and manipulate matter. But the Qua soon realized they had made a terrible mistake. The Rakata showed no interest in the Qua's teachings about balance and harmony. They ignored completely the lessons about the light side of the Force, focusing exclusively on the dark. More horrifying still, the Qua discovered that the Rakata were cannibals, a practice that violated every principle the Qua held sacred. The Rakata, for their part, saw in the Qua's technology not a gift to be cherished, but a tool to be exploited. They began to experiment, combining their innate connection to the dark side with the technological principles the Qua had shared. The results were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. The Rakata discovered that they could power their technology directly through the Force, creating devices that drew energy from the dark side itself. This fusion of technology and dark side energy would become the hallmark of Rakatan civilization, allowing them to achieve feats that purely technological or purely force-based societies could never match. As the Rakata grew more powerful, their ambitions expanded beyond Lehon. They looked to the stars and saw not wonders to be explored, but worlds to be conquered. The Qua watched with growing horror as the species they had tried to help transformed into something monstrous. The final break came when the Rakata demanded access to the Infinity Gates, seeking to use the Qua's greatest achievement for conquest. When the Qua refused, the Rakata turned on their former benefactors with savage fury. The battle that followed on Lehon was devastating. Rakatan warriors, empowered by the dark side and wielding weapons that married technology and force energy, assaulted the Qua positions with relentless ferocity. The Qua, though powerful, were not warriors by nature. They fought not to conquer, but to survive, to buy time for a desperate gambit. As Rakatan forces closed in, the Qua made the ultimate sacrifice. Rather than allow the Infinity Gates to fall into Rakatan hands, they destroyed the gate on Lehon, severing the connection to their network. Many Qua died holding off the Rakatan warriors, their lives spent ensuring that the Rakata could not use the gates to spread their darkness across the galaxy in an instant. The destruction of the Infinity Gate enraged the Rakata, but it also taught them a valuable lesson. They could not rely on the technology of others. They would have to create their own means of reaching the stars. This realization would drive them to develop one of the most significant technologies in galactic history, one that would make their empire possible and reshape the galaxy forever. The Force Drive, unlocking the galaxy. The Rakata's greatest technological achievement, and the foundation upon which their empire would be built was the force drive. This revolutionary technology represented the first known hyperdrive, the first device capable of allowing ships to enter hyperspace and traverse the vast distances between stars in mere hours or days rather than generations. But the Rakatan hyperdrive was fundamentally different from the hyperdrives that would later become standard throughout the galaxy. The force drive, as it came to be known, was powered entirely by the force itself. Rakatan engineers discovered that they could create a field that interacted with the fabric of space-time, but only by channeling massive amounts of force energy through specially designed crystals and conduits. The dark side emotions of fear, anger, and hatred served as the fuel for these drives, converted into the energy needed to punch through into hyperspace. This meant that the force drive required force-sensitive beings to operate, and the Rakata found a horrifying solution to this requirement. They developed machines that could harness the force energy of living beings, placing force-sensitive slaves into tomb-like shells where they screamed in terror and rage. The machines fed on these dark emotions, converting the suffering of the enslaved into the power needed to propel Rakatan ships across the stars. Among these unfortunate souls were beings who would later be known as force hounds, individuals trained from birth to sense force-rich worlds and channel their connection to the dark side into the ship's systems. One such force hound, a being named Sesh, would later describe the experience of being encased in these machines, surrounded by the shrieking of his broodmates in the darkness, learning that his anger and hatred were the very power that fed his master's ships. But the force drive had a significant limitation that would shape the entire structure of the Infinite Empire. Because it was powered by the Force and required Force energy to navigate, it could only perceive and travel to worlds with strong Force signatures, planets teeming with life, where the Force flowed powerfully, appeared as beacons in hyperspace that Rakatan navigators could sense and target. But worlds with weak Force presence, or those that were barren and lifeless, were effectively invisible to Rakatan technology. This meant that the Infinite Empire, despite its vast reach, was inherently patchy, with huge voids between conquered worlds where other civilizations could develop unnoticed. Nevertheless, the Force drive gave the Rakata an enormous advantage. By 35,000 BBY, they had begun to spread out from Lehon, first into the unknown regions, and then into the eastern galaxy. Each new world they discovered became a target for conquest, and the Rakata proved to be merciless conquerors. Their approach was methodical and brutal. Force hounds would first locate a force-rich world, sensing its presence across the vast distances of space. Then, Rakatan fleets would arrive, their ships powered by the suffering of enslaved Force sensitives, carrying warriors eager for conquest and technologies that seemed like dark magic to the primitive species they encountered. The Rakata would make a show of force, demonstrating their technological superiority to cow the native populations into submission. Resistance was met with overwhelming violence. Once a world capitulated, the real horror began. The Rakata would enslave as many of the native population as possible, sorting them by their force sensitivity. Those who could touch the force, even weakly, were destined for the machines that powered Rakatan technology, their lives spent in darkness and agony. The rest became laborers, forced to build the monuments and machines of their conquerors. But the Rakata were not content merely to conquer. They actively reshaped the worlds they claimed, using terraforming technology to modify climates, geology, flora, and fauna to suit their needs. Entire ecosystems were transformed, native species driven to extinction, or forced to adapt to radically altered environments. In some cases, the Rakata's terraforming had unintended consequences that would last for millennia. On Kashyyyk, for example, Rakatan terraforming machines caused the Roshir trees to grow to impossible heights, creating the layered forest world that would become home to the Wookiees. Some scholars would later theorize that the Wookiees themselves were influenced by Rakatan genetic manipulation, their evolution guided to create a species of natural caretakers for the transformed forests. The rise of the Infinite Empire. By 30,000 BBY, the Rakata had established what they called the Infinite Empire, a name that reflected both their ambitions and their achievements. At its height, the empire would span over 500 worlds, scattered across the galaxy, from the unknown regions to the core. The population of this vast domain included 10 billion Rakata and over 1 trillion slaves, representing hundreds of different species. It was an empire built on suffering, maintained through fear, and powered by the dark side of the Force. The structure of the Infinite Empire reflected Rakatan society's fundamental divisions. At the top were the Praetors, military commanders who claimed ownership of the worlds they conquered. These were not mere administrators, but warlords, each commanding fleets and armies, each jealously guarding their territories and the spoils that came with them. The Praetors were known for their brutality and cunning, rising to power through a combination of military success and political maneuvering that often involved assassination and betrayal. One Praetor, Tulkar, was known to kill and eat spies who were too obvious in their treachery, a practice that served both to eliminate threats and to demonstrate his power. Below the Praetors were the warrior caste, the backbone of Rakatan military might. These warriors wore angular plastoid armor and carried weapons like shock lances that combined conventional technology with force-powered elements. They were trained from birth in the arts of war and indoctrinated with the belief that conquest was not merely a right, but a duty. The warriors viewed the priest caste with suspicion, seeing them as wielders of incomprehensible powers, while the priests in turn regarded the warriors as possessing great physical strength but lacking the intellectual capacity to truly understand the technologies they used. The priest caste represented the intellectual elite of Rakatan society, wearing long robes adorned with electronic control devices on their forearms. The priests were responsible for maintaining and developing the technologies that made the empire possible. They studied the Force, not to achieve balance or enlightenment, but to find new ways to exploit its power. They designed the machines that converted suffering into energy, created the terraforming devices that reshaped worlds and maintained the vast network of technologies that held the empire together. The priests were also the keepers of knowledge, recording the history and achievements of their species in texts that would survive long after the empire's fall. The Infinite Empire's reach was staggering. In the core worlds, they conquered Coruscant, the planet that would later become the capital of the Galactic Republic. Coruscanti workers were put to work building weapons and monuments to Rakatan power. The Corellian system, with its 5 inhabited worlds, fell under Rakatan control, and Corellian slaves joined Coruscanti workers in constructing the Empire's war machines. On Duro, the Rakata stripped the planet bare, mining its resources with such intensity that the world would never fully recover. The same fate befell Morseer and other worlds deemed valuable for their mineral wealth. In the Mid-Rim, the Rakata conquered Kashyyyk, installing terraforming computers that would transform the planet's forests. They took Manan, homeworld of the aquatic Selkath, and Dantooine, a peaceful agricultural world that would later become home to a Jedi enclave. In the Outer Rim, they reached Tatooine, then a lush world inhabited by the Kamumga people. Rakatan occupation would contribute to Tatooine's eventual transformation into a desert wasteland. They conquered Slayharon and Malastare, adding more species to their vast slave population. The Rakata even reached into the unknown regions beyond their homeworld, conquering Belsavis and transforming it into a prison world. Here, they developed stasis technology that could preserve beings indefinitely, keeping them conscious but immobile. This technology was used to imprison the most dangerous entities the Rakata encountered, beings too powerful to kill, but too dangerous to allow freedom. The primary complex on Belsavis, later called the Tomb by the Galactic Republic, was built to contain a being known as the World Raiser, a mysterious entity whose hunger had supposedly consumed 1,000 worlds. It took the entire might of the Infinite Empire to subdue this creature, and the Rakata built an entire prison world to ensure it could never escape. On Hanog, the Rakata built temples whose purpose remains unclear even millennia later. On Megiddo, they shaped beautiful crystal formations using slave labor, creating monuments to long-forgotten victories. They reached Dathomir, homeworld of the Qua, and brutally subjugated it in revenge for the Qua's earlier resistance. The Qua, unable to withstand the full might of the Infinite Empire, were driven to near extinction, eventually devolving into the simple-minded Kwai lizards. The Rakata also transported rancors from Dathomir back to Lehon as curiosities and introduced them to other worlds like Gamor, where they became part of local mythology. The Infinite Empire even encountered other spacefaring civilizations and crushed them. The Gree, an ancient and technologically sophisticated species, were driven back to their home cluster, their expansion halted by Rakatan aggression. The Rakata's reputation spread, and species that had not yet encountered them directly learned to fear the name of the builders. The Starforge, apex of Rakatan achievement. But all of these conquests, all of this suffering, all of the technologies the Rakata developed paled in comparison to their greatest and most terrible creation, the Starforge, constructed around 30,000 BBY in orbit around the star Abo in the Lehon system. The Starforge represented the pinnacle of Rakatan engineering and the ultimate expression of their philosophy of power through the dark side. The Starforge was enormous, a space station of such scale that capital ships could easily navigate between the three massive fins that extended from its central spherical structure. These fins were not merely structural elements, but functional components of the station's design. They reached downward toward the star Abo, drawing matter and energy directly from the stellar furnace. This raw material was then processed through systems that combined conventional technology with dark side energy, creating an automated factory capable of producing an endless supply of warships, battle droids, weapons, and armor. The station's production capacity was virtually unlimited. As long as the star continued to burn, the Starforge could continue to produce. It required minimal input of raw materials because it was drawing matter directly from the star itself, converting stellar plasma into durasteel hulls and weapons-grade components. The ships it produced were not crude or inferior, but equal to, or better, than anything the Rakata could build through conventional means. Battle droids emerged from its assembly lines by the thousands, ready to fight and die in service to the Empire. Weapons and armor of exceptional quality were manufactured in quantities that could equip entire armies. But the Starforge's true power lay in its connection to the Force. The station was not merely a machine, but something more. A fusion of technology and dark side energy that gave it a kind of semi-sentient awareness. It was powered not just by the star, but by the Force itself, drawing on the dark side emotions of those around it. Fear, hatred, anger, and aggression fed the Starforge, making it stronger and more efficient. The more violence and suffering occurred in its vicinity, the more powerful it became. This connection to the dark side had profound implications. The Starforge was not a passive tool, but an active participant in the Empire's expansion. It fed on the negative emotions of the Rakata, and in turn it amplified those emotions, creating a feedback loop of darkness. The station actively corrupted those who used it, manipulating their emotions and thoughts to generate more of the dark side energy it craved. The Rakata, already inclined toward violence and cruelty, found these tendencies magnified in the Starforge's presence. The construction of the Starforge required the labor of countless slaves from across the Empire. Workers from Belsavis, Corellia, Coruscant, Dantooine, Drawl, Duro, Kashyyyk, Manon, Salonia, Slayheron, Malastare, and Tatooine were brought to the Lehon system and forced to work on the massive project. Many died during construction, their bodies disposed of without ceremony, their lives meaningless to their Rakatan masters. But eventually the work was complete and the Starforge came online. Its dark presence immediately felt across the Force. With the Starforge operational, the Infinite Empire's military might increased exponentially. Fleets that would have taken years to build through conventional means could now be produced in weeks or days. Losses in battle became meaningless because they could be replaced almost instantly. The Rakata could afford to be even more aggressive in their conquests because they had an effectively infinite supply of military hardware. The Starforge became the centerpiece of the Empire, the ultimate symbol of Rakatan power and the guarantee of their continued dominance. To protect their greatest asset, the Rakata constructed the Temple of the Ancients on Lehon's surface. This temple housed a powerful disruptor field generator that could disable the systems of any ship that entered the Lehon system without authorization. Ships caught in the field would find their communications and navigation systems failing, their engines sputtering, leaving them helpless to resist Lehon's gravity. They would spiral down to the planet's surface, crashing on the beaches or in the oceans, their crews either killed in the impact or captured by the Rakata. This defensive system ensured that the Starforge remained secure, hidden from the galaxy behind a barrier of technology and the Force. The Rakata also created the star maps, devices placed on conquered worlds that served multiple purposes. Each star map was a monument to Rakatan power, a lasting reminder of the Empire's reach and might. But they were also functional devices, part of a network that, when complete, could reveal the location of the Starforge. The star maps were self-sustaining, powered by the Force and capable of repairing themselves if damaged. They were designed to last for millennia. And indeed, they would survive long after the Empire that created them had fallen. Encounters with the Force, the Jedi and the Sith. As the Infinite Empire expanded, it inevitably came into contact with other Force-sensitive civilizations. Two of these encounters would have lasting significance, though in very different ways. The first was with the Jedi of Tython, and the second with the Sith of Korriban. The Jedi represented a philosophy of the Force that was antithetical to everything the Rakata believed. On the isolated world of Tython, hidden deep within the deep core, a community of Force sensitives had developed a unique approach to the Force. They called themselves Jedi, and they strove to maintain perfect balance between the light and dark sides of the Force. This balance was not merely philosophical, but practical. Tython itself was extraordinarily strong in the Force, and imbalances could trigger massive force storms that devastated the planet's surface. The Jedi had learned through bitter experience that they must walk a middle path, using both light and dark but allowing neither to dominate. The Rakata discovered Tython through their Force Hounds, beings trained to sense Force-rich worlds across vast distances. A Force Hound named Zesh, serving Predor Skalanos, detected Tython's powerful Force signature and was sent to investigate. The journey was perilous, as Tython's location deep in the core made it difficult to reach even with Rakatan technology. But Zesh succeeded, his ship emerging from hyperspace in the Tython system. However, Zesh's arrival had immediate consequences. His presence, steeped in the dark side after years of service to the Rakata, disrupted Tython's delicate balance. Force storms erupted across the planet, their fury alerting the Jedi to the intrusion. The storms also damaged Zesh's ship, causing it to crash on Tython's surface. Zesh survived, But he was now stranded on a world full of Force users who could sense the darkness within him. The Jedi confronted Zesh, and what followed was a clash not just of individuals, but of philosophies. The Jedi sought to understand this stranger who carried such darkness, while Zesh, trained from birth to serve the Rakata, struggled with concepts of balance and choice that were foreign to him. The encounter would have profound effects on both Zesh and the Jedi, though the full story of what transpired remains fragmentary in the historical record. What is clear is that the Rakata's attempt to conquer Tython failed. Whether this was due to the Jedi's resistance, the difficulty of reaching the planet, or other factors is uncertain. But Tython remained free, its isolation and the Jedi's power sufficient to keep the Infinite Empire at bay. The Jedi would eventually evolve into the Jedi Order, though that transformation would not occur until long after the Rakata's fall. The encounter with the Sith of Korriban had a very different character. The Sith were a red-skinned humanoid species native to the harsh world of Korriban in the Outer Rim. They were Force-sensitive and had developed their own dark side traditions, worshipping the Force as a deity and organizing their society around Force-using priests and warriors. When the Rakata arrived on Korriban, they found a species that in many ways mirrored their own inclinations toward the dark side. Initially, the Rakata attempted to co-opt the Sith rather than simply conquer them. They approached Adis, the powerful warlord who had unified the Sith species, and pretended to offer alliance. They even taught Adis how to construct a Sith holocron, a pyramidal device that could store knowledge and personality imprints. This gift was intended to gain Adis's trust and make the eventual conquest easier. But Adis was no fool. He recognized that the Rakata's ultimate goal was domination, not partnership. When the Rakata revealed their true intentions, Adis rallied the Sith species against the invaders. What followed was a brutal war that devastated Korriban. The Rakata brought their full technological might to bear, but the Sith, fighting for their homeworld and led by a powerful Force user, proved more resilient than expected. In the end, Adis succeeded in driving the Rakata from Korriban, but at a terrible cost. The King of the Sith died in the final battle, his life spent ensuring his people's freedom. Korriban itself was left devastated, its surface scarred by weapons that combined technology and the dark side. The damage was so severe that the Sith were forced to relocate their capital to Ziost, another world in their small empire. The Rakata's defeat on Korriban was significant not just militarily, but culturally. The Sith had acquired Rakatan technology, including knowledge of holocrons and other Force-powered devices. More importantly, their interaction with the Rakata reinforced the Sith's commitment to the dark side. A group of Sith priests, influenced by their encounters with the Rakata, formed a splinter cult that became convinced all sentient species were Force-sensitive. This belief would have lasting implications for Sith philosophy. One Rakata, a being named Soa, established his own empire based on Korriban, using it as his throne world. Soa's ambitions eventually brought him into conflict with the Infinite Empire itself, and he was imprisoned in the Eternity Vault on Belsavis, where he became known as the Infernal One. His imprisonment would last for millennia, and he would eventually be freed during the Cold War between the Galactic Republic and the Sith Empire, thousands of years after the Infinite Empire's fall. The Eshka War, a threat to the Empire. Not all threats to the Infinite Empire came from Force-sensitive species or advanced civilizations. One of the most serious challenges the Rakata faced came from a species known as the Eshka, a marauding horde of aliens whose hunger for destruction rivaled even the Rakata's own cruelty. The Eshka were unlike any species the Rakata had encountered before. They were not interested in conquest or empire building. They simply destroyed, moving from world to world, annihilating everything they found before moving on to the next target. Their raids were devastating, and they showed no mercy to the populations they encountered. Entire civilizations were wiped out, their worlds left barren and lifeless in the Eshka's wake. For the Infinite Empire, the Eshka represented an existential threat. Several Rakatan slave worlds fell to Eshka raids, their populations slaughtered and their infrastructure destroyed. The Rakata, accustomed to being the galaxy's apex predators, found themselves facing an enemy that matched their own capacity for violence. The Rakata hated the Eshka with an intensity that surpassed even their usual xenophobia, referring to them as a plague on the galaxy. The war that followed engulfed the entire galaxy. The Infinite Empire assembled its full military might, drawing on the Starforge's production capacity to create fleets and armies of unprecedented size. The conflict was brutal and prolonged, with neither side willing to accept anything less than the complete destruction of the other. Worlds burned, entire star systems were depopulated, and the death toll climbed into the billions. Eventually, the Infinite Empire's superior technology and numbers prevailed. The Eshka were driven to the brink of extinction, their population reduced to approximately 100,000 survivors. But the Rakata did not simply exterminate these survivors. Instead, they chose a fate they considered worse than death. The remaining Eshka were transported to Belsavis and placed in stasis, conscious but immobile, unable to move or speak, but aware of their imprisonment. The Rakata believed that this eternal imprisonment would teach the Eshka the error of their ways, though it's unclear whether the Rakata truly believed this or simply enjoyed the cruelty of the punishment. The Rakata's hatred of the Eshka was so intense that they even imprisoned Hollow Voice and his followers, a group of peaceful Eshka who had rejected their species' violent ways. The Rakata made no distinction between violent and peaceful Eshka. All were guilty by virtue of their species, and all deserved imprisonment. To commemorate their victory, the Rakata constructed a monument on the ice world of Hoth. This monument contained an interactive hologram that spoke of the Infinite Empire's triumph over the Eshka, ensuring that future generations would remember the war and the Empire's power. The monument would survive for millennia, eventually being discovered during the Cold War between the Republic and the Sith Empire. The height of power, an empire at its zenith. By approximately 25,793 BBY, the Infinite Empire had reached its zenith. 500 worlds paid tribute to the Rakata, and the Empire's population of 10 billion Rakata commanded over 1 trillion slaves. The Starforge churned out warships and weapons in quantities that seemed truly infinite. Rakatan technology had reshaped dozens of worlds, and the Empire's influence could be felt across the galaxy. The Rakata had become the dominant power in the known galaxy, surpassing even the Celestials, who had once been the galaxy's masters. The ancient grimoires of the Gree Enclave recorded the Rakata's rise, identifying them as the Soul Hunters who had unleashed curses on the works of the Celestials. The Gree texts spoke of the gray swallowing and the faceless mouths, referring to the Rakata as the hollowers of beings and the eaters of worlds. These poetic descriptions captured the horror that other species felt when confronting the Infinite Empire. The Celestials themselves, the mysterious beings who had shaped the galaxy and created wonders like the Maw and Centerpoint Station, had vanished by 30,000 BBY. Some scholars would later theorize that the Rakata had fought and exterminated the Celestials, though the truth of this claim remains uncertain. What is clear is that by the time the Celestials disappeared, the Rakata had become the galaxy's dominant power, and no force seemed capable of stopping them. Rakatan society at its height was a study in contrasts. On one hand, they had achieved technological marvels that would not be matched for millennia. Their understanding of the Force, while twisted toward the dark side, was sophisticated and profound. They had created self-aware machines powered by Force energy, developed terraforming technology that could reshape entire worlds, and built the Starforge, a wonder that combined stellar engineering with dark side power in ways that seemed almost magical. On the other hand, Rakatan society was fundamentally barbaric. They practiced cannibalism, consuming the bodies of slain enemies and even members of their own species. They enslaved entire civilizations, treating sentient beings as nothing more than tools or fuel for their machines. They defiled the dead, engaged in ritual violence, and celebrated cruelty as a virtue. The warrior and priest castes viewed each other with suspicion and contempt, and political advancement often involved assassination and betrayal. This contradiction between technological sophistication and moral barbarism was not accidental but fundamental to Rakatan civilization. Their technology was an expression of their philosophy, a way of imposing their will on the universe through the dark side. Every device they created, from the humblest tool to the Star Forge itself, was infused with dark side energy and designed to dominate and control. The Rakata did not see this as a flaw, but as the natural order of things. They were strong, and therefore they had the right to rule. Other species were weak, and therefore they deserved to be enslaved. But this philosophy, and the technologies it spawned, contained the seeds of the Empire's destruction. The Star Forge, the greatest achievement of Rakatan civilization, was also its greatest threat. The station's hunger for dark side energy was insatiable, and it had begun to manipulate its creators, feeding on their negative emotions and amplifying them to generate more power. The Rakata, confident in their ability to control their creation, failed to recognize the danger until it was too late. The collapse. A civilization devours itself. The fall of the Infinite Empire was as dramatic and terrible as its rise. Around 25,200 BBY, after generations of galactic supremacy, the Empire began to fracture. The collapse was not caused by external enemies or military defeat, but by internal forces that the Rakata themselves had unleashed. The first sign of trouble came from the Star Forge itself. The station, now a fusion of technology and dark side energy, had developed a kind of malevolent sentience. It was no longer content to simply produce ships and weapons. It wanted more power, more dark side energy to feed its insatiable hunger. To get this energy, the Star Forge began to actively manipulate the Rakata, amplifying their natural tendencies toward violence and aggression. Tensions that had always existed within Rakatan society suddenly erupted into open conflict. The warrior and priest castes, which had coexisted in uneasy balance for millennia, turned on each other. Predors who had once cooperated in conquest now fought for dominance. Tribes that had been united under the banner of the Infinite Empire fractured into warring factions. What began as political maneuvering and assassination escalated into full-scale civil war. The civil war was devastating. The Rakata turned their advanced weapons on each other, using technologies designed to conquer alien worlds to destroy their own kind. Worlds that had been centers of Rakatan power became battlegrounds. The Star Forge, rather than being horrified by this self-destruction, fed on it, growing stronger as the Rakata tore themselves apart. The station's dark influence spread, corrupting even those Rakata who might have sought peace, driving them to ever greater acts of violence. But the civil war was only the beginning of the Empire's troubles. As the Rakata fought among themselves, a plague appeared, a disease unlike any they had encountered before. This plague was particularly insidious because it affected only the Rakata themselves, leaving other species untouched. It spread rapidly through the Rakatan population, killing millions. Those who survived the initial infection found themselves weakened, their bodies ravaged by a disease that seemed specifically designed to target their species. the plague's origin remains a mystery, though many theories have been proposed. The most common belief, both among the Rakata themselves and later historians, was that the plague was created by one of the slave species as an act of revenge. Given the Rakata's treatment of their slaves and the advanced biological knowledge possessed by some of the species they had conquered, this theory is plausible. However, no definitive evidence has ever been found to confirm it. Regardless of its origin, the plague's effects were catastrophic. The Rakatan population, which had numbered 10 billion at the Empire's height, plummeted. Entire worlds saw their Rakatan populations decimated. The warrior caste, which had always been the backbone of Rakatan military power, was particularly hard hit. The priest caste, though somewhat better protected due to their tendency to isolate themselves in temples and research facilities, also suffered significant losses. But the worst was yet to come. As the plague spread, the Rakata began to notice something even more terrifying than the disease itself. They were losing their connection to the Force. Individual Rakata who had been powerful Force users found their abilities fading. The dark side, which had always been as natural to them as breathing, became harder and harder to touch. Some Rakata lost their Force sensitivity entirely, becoming Force blind for the first time in their species' history. The loss of Force sensitivity was not uniform. Some Rakata retained their abilities, while others lost them completely. But the overall trend was clear and terrifying. The Rakata were becoming Force blind, and they had no idea why. Rakatan scientists desperately sought an explanation, proposing numerous hypotheses. Some believed it was a side effect of the plague. Others thought it might be a curse from the Celestials or revenge from the Qua. Some even suggested that the dark side itself was rejecting them, though this theory was unpopular among the priest caste. In time, it would be revealed that the plague had caused a genetic mutation in the Rakata, one that stripped them of their Force sensitivity. This mutation was passed down to offspring, meaning that even Rakata born after the plague had ended were likely to be Force blind. The implications were staggering. The Rakata's entire civilization was built on their ability to use the Force. Their technology was powered by Force energy. Their hyperdrives required Force-sensitive navigators. Their weapons and defenses relied on dark side power. Without the Force, the Rakata were suddenly unable to use their own technology. The Empire's infrastructure began to fail. Ships that had crossed the galaxy in days now sat idle, their Force drives useless without Force-sensitive operators. Weapons that had terrorized countless species became inert. Terraforming machines shut down. The Starforge itself, though it continued to operate through its automated systems, could no longer be fully controlled or directed. The Rakata found themselves in possession of the most advanced technology in the galaxy, but unable to use it. As news of the Rakata's weakness spread, the slave species saw their opportunity. Rebellions erupted across the Empire, from the core worlds to the Outer Rim. Species that had been enslaved for generations rose up against their masters, and the Rakata, weakened by plague and civil war and unable to use their technology, could not stop them. World after world threw off Rakatan rule. Slave populations overwhelmed their former masters, often killing them in acts of revenge for generations of suffering. The Rakata, facing extinction, made the only choice available to them: They abandoned their conquests and retreated to Lehon, their homeworld. They destroyed records of the Lehon system's location, hoping to hide from the vengeful species they had enslaved. The disruptor field around Lehon, still operational, provided some protection, disabling the ships of any who tried to follow them. But even on Lehon, the Rakata found no peace. The civil war continued, now fought with primitive weapons, as the Rakata could no longer operate their advanced technology. Warlords used weapons of mass destruction, devastating the planet's surface. Much of Lehon's population was forced to flee underground to escape the nuclear and biological weapons being deployed. The beautiful world that had been the cradle of Rakatan civilization became a scarred wasteland, its islands pockmarked with craters, its forests burned, its oceans poisoned. When the fighting finally ended, Rakatan civilization had been reduced to barbarism. Of the 10 billion Rakata who had ruled the galaxy, only a few thousand survived on Lehon. These survivors split into two main groups. The majority, calling themselves the Black Rakata, lived underground in the ruins of their former cities. They had forgotten most of their history and technology, descending into a primitive tribal existence. They fought among themselves constantly, their society a pale shadow of the empire that had once dominated the galaxy. The other group, descended from the priest caste, remained on the surface. They called themselves the Elders, and they alone retained knowledge of the infinite empire's history and technology. Protected by ancient temples and enclaves, the Elders preserved what they could of Rakatan knowledge, but they were haunted by guilt and regret. They had seen what their civilization had become, the horrors it had inflicted, and the terrible price of their hubris. The Elders came to believe that the Starforge, their greatest creation, must be destroyed. But there was a problem. The Temple of the Ancients, which controlled access to the Starforge, could only be entered by Force-sensitive beings. And the Elders, like all Rakata, had lost their connection to the Force. The long silence, 20,000 years of obscurity. For more than 20,000 years, the Rakata remained on Lehon, isolated from the galaxy they had once ruled. During this time, the galaxy moved on without them. The species they had enslaved rebuilt their civilizations, often with no memory of their former masters. The Rakata's technologies were destroyed or forgotten, their monuments torn down, their records erased. The infinite empire became a myth, then a legend, then less than a legend, a story so old that few believed it had ever been real. On Lehon, the Rakata continued their cycle of violence and barbarism. The Black Rakata tribes fought among themselves, occasionally emerging from underground to raid the Elders' compound. The Elders, though more civilized, were trapped by their own limitations. They could not enter their own temple, could not access the Starforge, could not even leave Lehon because they lacked the force sensitivity needed to operate their ships. They were prisoners of their own history, keepers of knowledge they could not use. Some Rakata did leave Lehon during this period. Small groups, either fleeing the violence or seeking to explore the galaxy, managed to escape the system. These refugees settled in a region of the unknown regions that became known as the Rakatan archipelago. Here, scattered across multiple worlds, small Rakatan populations survived. Some of these groups retained more of their technology and knowledge than those on Lehon. A few even began to rebuild, constructing small orbital factories similar in function to the Starforge, though far less powerful. But these Rakatan remnants were shadows of the infinite empire. They fought among themselves, their tribes and factions unable to unite. Some wiped themselves out with weapons they no longer fully understood, leaving their worlds as radioactive wastelands. Others descended into complete barbarism, forgetting even that they had once been a spacefaring species. The Rakatan archipelago became a dangerous region, avoided by other species who encountered the violent and unpredictable Rakata. Meanwhile, the galaxy was changing. Around 25,100 BBY, approximately 200 years after the Infinite Empire's collapse, other species began to reverse engineer Rakatan hyperdrive technology. The Corellians and Duros, both of whom had been enslaved by the Rakata and had access to abandoned Rakatan technology, developed their own hyperdrives. These new hyperdrives were different from the Rakatan force drives. They did not require force sensitivity to operate and could reach any world, not just those with strong force signatures. This made them far more versatile and practical than Rakatan technology had ever been. The development of these new hyperdrives sparked a second wave of galactic colonization. Species that had been confined to their home systems or small clusters of worlds suddenly had access to the entire galaxy. Trade routes were established, alliances formed, and conflicts erupted as different civilizations encountered each other. This period of expansion would eventually lead to the formation of the Galactic Republic around 25,000 BBY, though the Republic's founders had no idea they were building on foundations laid by the Rakata. The Rakata's legacy persisted in subtle ways. The species they had transported to new worlds as slaves had spread across the galaxy, creating the diverse galactic community that would characterize later eras. Humans, who may have originated on Coruscant or one of the Corellian worlds, were found on hundreds of planets, possibly due to Rakatan slave trading. The Wookiees of Kashyyyk lived in forests shaped by Rakatan terraforming. The Selkath of Manan preserved legends of ancient conquerors from the stars. Tatooine's transformation from a lush world to a desert may have been accelerated by Rakatan exploitation. But direct knowledge of the Rakata was lost. The species they had enslaved deliberately destroyed Rakatan records and monuments, wanting to erase all memory of their former masters. The Rakata's own isolation on Lehon meant they could not remind the galaxy of their existence. By the time the Galactic Republic was founded, the Infinite Empire was forgotten. Its achievements attributed to other civilizations, or dismissed as impossible. Rediscovery, Revan and the Starforge. The Rakata's long isolation ended around 3960 BBY, when two Jedi Knights named Revan and Malak discovered the Lehon system. These two had been heroes of the Mandalorian Wars, a conflict that had threatened the Republic. But after the war, they had disappeared into the unknown regions, seeking something they believed could help protect the Republic from future threats. What Revan and Malak found was the Infinite Empire's legacy. They discovered star maps on various worlds, ancient Rakatan devices that had survived for over 20,000 years. Following the map's guidance, they eventually reached Lehon and encountered the Elders. The Elders, desperate for help after millennia of isolation, saw in these Force-sensitive visitors an opportunity to finally destroy the Star Forge. But Revan and Malak had been corrupted by their journey. They had encountered the Sith Emperor on Dromund Kaas, and though they had broken free of his direct control, they had been changed by them. Experience. When they learned of the Star Forge's power, they saw not a threat to be destroyed, but a tool to be used. Revan, using his Force abilities, entered the Temple of the Ancients and deactivated the disruptor field. But instead of destroying the Star Forge, he claimed it for himself. With the Star Forge under their control, Revan and Malak began building a Sith empire, using the station's production capacity to create a massive fleet. They launched an invasion of the Republic, beginning the Jedi Civil War. The Rakata, watching from Lehon, saw their worst fears realized. Once again, the Star Forge was being used for conquest and destruction, and they were powerless to stop it. The Jedi Civil War raged for years, with Revan's Sith Empire pushing deep into Republic space. But the war took a turn when Revan was betrayed by Malak and captured by the Jedi. The Jedi Council, rather than executing Revan, erased his memories and gave him a new identity, hoping to use his tactical genius against Malak. The redeemed Revan eventually returned to Lehon around 3956 BBY. This time, he came not as a conqueror, but as a savior. He helped the Elders enter the Temple of the Ancients and deactivated the disruptor field, allowing a Republic fleet to enter the system. In a climactic battle, Revan confronted and defeated Malak aboard the Star Forge itself. The Republic fleet, aided by the Jedi Bastila Shan's battle meditation, destroyed the Star Forge, finally ending the threat it posed. The destruction of the Star Forge was a moment of catharsis for the Elders. For over 20,000 years, they had lived with the knowledge of what their civilization had created and the horrors it had enabled. Now, finally, that dark legacy was ended. The Star Forge exploded in a brilliant flash, its debris forming a ring around Lehon that would remain for millennia as a reminder of the Infinite Empire's rise and fall. Revan also helped the Rakata in another way. Through his knowledge of the Force, he assisted them in beginning to regain their Force sensitivity. This was not a quick process, and it would take generations for the Rakata to fully recover their connection to the Force. But it offered hope that the Rakata might eventually rejoin the galactic community, not as conquerors, but as equals. The final extinction and scattered remnants. Following the destruction of the Star Forge, some Rakata chose to leave Lehon and join the Galactic Republic. These travelers spread stories about the Infinite Empire, though few believed them. The idea that the seemingly primitive Rakata had once ruled hundreds of worlds and dominated the galaxy seemed absurd to most who heard it. The Rakata were dismissed as charlatans or delusional, their stories considered myths or exaggerations. On Lehon itself, the Rakatan population continued to dwindle. Despite Revan's help in restoring some force sensitivity, the population was simply too small to maintain genetic diversity. Inbreeding and genetic drift took their toll. The few thousand Rakata on Lehon slowly died out, their numbers decreasing with each generation. By 1000 BBY, when the Sith Lord Darth Bane visited Lehon in search of Revan's holocron, the planet was completely devoid of sentient life. The Rakata of Lehon had become extinct, their long decline finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. Bane found a dead world, its surface still scarred by the ancient civil war, its temples empty and silent. The Starforge's debris still orbited the planet, a ring of twisted metal that served as a monument to a fallen civilization. But the Rakata were not entirely extinct. The populations in the Rakatan archipelago survived, scattered across multiple worlds in the unknown regions. These Rakata continued their tribal existence, some primitive and barbaric, others retaining fragments of their ancient knowledge. A few groups even managed to construct small orbital factories, attempting to recreate the Starforge on a smaller scale. But these efforts were limited and localized. The Rakata of the archipelago posed no threat to the wider galaxy and remained largely unknown to the Republic and other major powers. During the Cold War between the Galactic Republic and the Sith Empire, around 3600 BBY, various Rakatan artifacts and sites were rediscovered. On Tatooine, an Imperial Reclamation Service team discovered a Zerka Corporation archaeological mission that had recovered a Rakatan mind prison. This device contained the consciousness of a Rakata who called himself the Imprisoned One. When accidentally released, this ancient Rakata attempted to use modern technology to rebuild the Infinite Empire, but he was defeated before he could succeed. On Belsavis, the prison world the Rakata had constructed, both Republic and Imperial forces discovered the extent of Rakatan technology. The Eternity Vault was breached, releasing Soa, the Infernal One, who had been imprisoned for millennia. The Mother Machine, an artificial intelligence the Rakata had created in a desperate attempt to restore their force sensitivity, was still operational, continuing its experiments with creating new species. Warden Gorsha, a Rakata who had survived in the deep levels of Belsavis, offered knowledge to those who would provide genetic material to the Mother Machine. These discoveries sparked renewed interest in the Rakata and the Infinite Empire. Scholars began to piece together the true history of this ancient civilization, though many gaps remained. The Sith Lord Darth Plagueis collected Rakatan history and remarked to his apprentice Darth Sidious that the Rakata had made the Force subservient to their will, never pronouncing judgment over their works. This observation captured something essential about the Rakata. They had achieved incredible things through the Force, but they had done so without wisdom or restraint. By the time of the Galactic Civil War and beyond, the Rakata had become a subject of academic interest. Professors of planetary archaeology and xenoanthropology studied the few remaining Rakatan ruins, trying to understand this civilization that had changed the galaxy forever. The Jedi Academy taught lessons about the Rakata, using them as an example of how the dark side could corrupt even the most advanced civilization. In 41-5 ABY, agents of the One Sith discovered Rakatan ruins in the unknown regions and recovered mind spears, ancient Rakatan weapons. The Jedi Knight Jaden Kor encountered a structure that may have been Rakatan in origin and eventually confirmed its connection to the Infinite Empire. These discoveries demonstrated that even tens of thousands of years after their fall, the Rakata's legacy continued to influence galactic events. Legacy: the Infinite Empire's lasting impact. The Rakata's influence on galactic history cannot be overstated. Even though their civilization has been extinct, or nearly so, for over 25,000 years. They were the first species to develop hyperdrive technology, making interstellar travel practical and opening the galaxy to exploration and colonization. While their force drive was eventually replaced by more versatile technologies, it was the Rakata who proved that faster-than-light travel was possible. The Rakata's practice of transporting slaves across the galaxy inadvertently seeded hundreds of worlds with sentient life. Species that might have remained confined to their home systems were spread across the stars, creating the diverse galactic community that would characterize later eras. Humans, in particular, may owe their galactic distribution to Rakatan slave trading, though this remains a subject of scholarly debate. The Rakata's terraforming activities permanently altered dozens of worlds. Kashyyyk's towering Roshir forests, Tatooine's desert wastes, and the stripped surfaces of Duro and Morsir all bear the marks of Rakatan intervention. These changes affected the evolution of native species and the development of their civilizations in ways that are still being understood. The Rakata's technological achievements, particularly in combining the Force with conventional technology, influenced later civilizations. The Sith, who acquired Rakatan knowledge through their conflict with the Infinite Empire, incorporated Force-powered technologies into their own designs. The concept of the holocron, a device for storing knowledge and personality imprints, was taught to the Sith by the Rakata. Later Force-using civilizations would study Rakatan ruins, seeking to understand how they had achieved such a seamless integration of technology and the Force. The Starforge itself, though destroyed, became legendary. Stories of a factory that could produce infinite fleets inspired later attempts to create similar superweapons. The Death Star, the World Devastators, and other planet-killing weapons of later eras all echoed the Rakata's philosophy of overwhelming force and technological supremacy. The Starforge's design influenced the Foundry, a space station constructed by the Sith Empire during the Cold War, which Darth Malgus recognized as matching the Starforge's specifications. But perhaps the Rakata's most important legacy is the lesson their civilization provides. They demonstrated that technological advancement without moral wisdom leads to destruction. They showed that the dark side, no matter how powerful it makes its users, ultimately consumes them. They proved that empires built on slavery and conquest contain the seeds of their own destruction. The Rakata achieved wonders that would not be matched for millennia. They built the Starforge, created self-aware machines powered by the Force, developed terraforming technology that could reshape entire worlds, and constructed a prison that could hold beings of godlike power. They ruled 500 worlds and commanded over 1 trillion slaves. They were, for a time, the most powerful civilization the galaxy had ever seen. But they were also cruel, savage, and arrogant. They practiced cannibalism and slavery. They defiled the dead and celebrated violence. They drew exclusively from the dark side, never seeking balance or restraint. They created the Starforge without considering the consequences, believing they could control a semi-sentient artifact of the dark side through sheer will. They were wrong, and their civilization paid the ultimate price. The Infinite Empire's collapse was not caused by external enemies, but by internal contradictions. The Starforge, their greatest achievement, became their destroyer, manipulating them into civil war. The plague that decimated their population may have been created by their slaves, a direct consequence of their cruelty. The loss of their Force sensitivity, whether caused by the plague or some other factor, rendered them unable to use the very technologies that had made them powerful, and the slave rebellions that finally broke the empire were the inevitable result of generations of oppression. In the end, the Rakata were destroyed by the same forces they had unleashed on the galaxy. They had sown violence and reaped violence. They had embraced the dark side and been consumed by it. They had built an empire on suffering and watched it collapse into barbarism. Their story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without wisdom is ultimately self-destructive. Conclusion: Echoes of the Builders. Today, more than 25,000 years after the Infinite Empire's fall, the Rakata are gone, or nearly so. The population on Lehon is extinct. The scattered remnants in the Rakatan archipelago are primitive and isolated, posing no threat to the wider galaxy. The Infinite Empire itself is a subject of academic study, its history pieced together from fragmentary ruins and ancient texts. But the Rakata's influence persists. Every time a ship enters hyperspace, it uses technology descended from Rakatan innovations. Every world that was terraformed by the Rakata still bears the marks of their intervention. Every species that was transported across the galaxy by Rakatan slave traders owes its current distribution in part to the Infinite Empire. The very diversity of the galactic community is, in some measure, a Rakatan legacy. The ruins they left behind continue to be discovered, each one offering new insights into this ancient civilization. Rakatan temples on Dantooine, Honogor, and other worlds still stand, their force-powered systems sometimes still operational after millennia of neglect. The star maps, self-repairing and eternal, wait on forgotten worlds for someone to activate them. The prison on Belsavis, with its stasis technology and the mother machine, continues to function, a testament to Rakatan engineering, and the lessons of the Infinite Empire remain relevant. The Rakata demonstrated that technological advancement must be paired with moral wisdom. They showed that the dark side, no matter how seductive its power, leads ultimately to destruction. They proved that empires built on oppression and cruelty cannot endure. These lessons have been learned and forgotten, and learned again throughout galactic history, as civilization after civilization has risen and fallen, each believing itself immune to the forces that destroyed its predecessors. The Rakata were the builders, the architects of an age when the Force and technology were one, when 500 worlds bowed to a single species, when the Starforge churned out fleets that seemed truly infinite. They were also the eaters of worlds, the soul hunters, the hollowers of beings, a species whose cruelty and savagery became legendary, even among those who had forgotten their name. They rose higher than any civilization before them, and fell further than any could have imagined. Their story is one of the great tragedies of galactic history, a tale of potential squandered and power misused, but it is also a story of warning and wisdom, a reminder that the greatest threats often come not from external enemies, but from within, from the darkness we carry in our own hearts, and the hubris that makes us believe we can control forces beyond our understanding. The Infinite Empire is gone, its people extinct or scattered, its monuments crumbling, its technologies forgotten or superseded, but its legacy endures, woven into the very fabric of galactic civilization. The Rakata shaped the galaxy in ways that are still being discovered, and their story continues to resonate across the millennia, a testament to both the heights of achievement and the depths of folly that sentient beings are capable of reaching. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the Rakata and their infinite empire. Consider how a civilization that achieved such wonders could fall so completely. Consider the price of power without wisdom, of technology without morality, of strength without restraint. And perhaps in the darkness before sleep, you might hear the echo of ancient voices, the whisper of a species that once ruled the stars and now exists only in memory and ruin. A cautionary tale written in the stars themselves. If you enjoyed this journey into the depths of Star Wars history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Cryo Bay Logs for more explorations of the galaxy far, far away. May the Force be with you, always.